to Spotlights. This is a podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm very honored and excited to welcome onto the program Timothy Morton. Tim, thanks for making time for us.
Sam, it's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you very, very much for having me.
Oh, yeah, the pleasure and honor is all mine. And a little bio for folks who might not know you. You're the Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English at Rice University, and you've collaborated with amazing people, scholars and artists, people like Bjork, Laurie Anderson, Adam McKay, Pharrell Williams, and many other people. You co-wrote and appear in the documentary Living in the Future's Past, a global warming film featuring Jeff Bridges, which is very lovely. And you're the author of the libretto for the opera Time, Time, Time by Jennifer Walsh, and the author of many, many books, some of which are on the shelf behind me right now. And Being Ecological, Humankind, Dark Ecology, Hyperobjects, Realist Magic, The Ecological Thought, and Ecology Without Nature. And I've been following your work pretty closely since Ecology Without Nature, which I know was not your first book. You'd done a lot of work before that. And the new book that just came out, I've been excited about since I heard you were writing. It's called Hell, In Search of a Christian Ecology. That's out with Columbia University Press. And I have a lot of questions for you about it. I just want to hear a lot about your process in writing it. But I got to say, I've been just tearing through it over the last few days and had trouble putting it down. It's a cool, beautiful, it's merciful, it's forgiving, it's joyous, and also deeply vulnerable and personal. So absolute joy. I found myself, every few pages or something, anytime I take a break and I'm talking to my wife, I'm like, I'm really enjoying hell. Like what a funny sentence to keep coming out of my mouth. And I think that is kind of part of the intention of the book, is to really explore what hell means, hell, heaven, and that kind of binary relationship. So anyway, before we get into that, I want to talk about how personal the book is. And because I knew your work had a kind of a deeply Buddhist influence. But recently there's been this turn to Christianity, or a return. And you describe yourself as born again, and really, really incredible. But you don't just start with this kind of born again, you go all the way back to early childhood. So I wonder if you could share why the impetus to be so, I guess we could say confessional or personal with this book in a way that you haven't really with a lot of the other books.
Sure. Well, so the word philosopher, which is a word people sometimes say about me. Gary Snyder read my book called The Ecological Thought, and he said to a mutual friend, "Oh, this is a book of philosophy." I would never have described myself that way. It seemed a little arrogant to do so, but it's sort of cool as an insult, and people kind of introduce me as, and now the philosopher Timothy Morton will blah 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 blah. Just as a side note, actually, I accidentally ended up with this book writing what the editor called theology. When Columbia read it, they said, "Oh, this is theology. We need to sell this to our Christian and theological audiences." And I was just as amazed as when Gary said that the book the Ecological Thought was a philosophy book. So, but you'll notice that in the word philosophy, there aren't actually any ideas in there. There's basically two emotions, right? There's love and there's wisdom. If you were going to choose between, wisdom is a set of instructions, like a fortune cookie that you crack open or whatever, five bullet pointed, ways to live, or what have you. I think you'd probably agree that actually wisdom is more like an emotion than a series of ideas. It's a feeling, right? That the last syllable of that word suggests a kind of quality of wise, right? And obviously love is an emotion. Yeah. As I get older, I kind of relate more and more to what I learned from deconstruction, actually. What I learned from Jacques Derrida, being maybe the very first person who, in scholarship world, who was actually nice about my stuff, right? And how can you not like someone who's nice about your stuff? But in a way, philosophy, in a sense, is about trying not to have ideas rather than trying to have ideas. And sort of why, but why is that, right? Why? Well, in a way, ideas and feelings are not the opposite of each other. Ideas, in a way, are the output of various kinds of feeling process, whether they be social processes or, you just discovered something or some kind of mixture of personal and political or whatever that may be, right? Whereas in a certain way of feeling is an idea that you haven't had yet,
Hmm.
right? Like in a way of feeling is an idea from the future. Like why else would you do therapy? You go into the therapist's office and you say, I'm having this feeling, I can't understand it. And then you put some ideas to it and then you feel this relief, right? And you go on to the next thing. So in a way, when you're writing, you need to follow the precepts of Obi-Wan Kenobi and trust your feelings. Because in a way, if you want to do original work, and why wouldn't you want to sort of in a way surprise yourself as well as other people? Your feelings are the things you're kind of going with, right? And the more I write, the deeper I have to go into those feelings to try to find something that's kind of from the future, because I'm always trying to write from the future, you know. Luckily for everybody else, nobody else sees my stuff as self-help from future Tim, but that's sort of how I see my stuff. But there came this point at which I couldn't do anything other than what is sometimes nowadays called auto theory, right? I couldn't not make it personal, if that's the right double negative.
Right.
I'm a bit sort of nervous about doing this because it's so meaningful to me that we will be talking. Um, I sort of ended up, if you're going to talk about religion, which I wanted to talk about, for various different reasons. If you're going to talk about religion, you've got to talk about very primordial things in a certain way. What is called religion spirituality deals with some of the nastiest, unquote, most grotesque, unquote, most terrifying, most wondrous. Like why do you watch sci-fi in a way? Christopher Nolan said sci-fi is a mode that allows you to explore extreme emotion, right? It's a kind of spacesuit, that allows you to experience mind-shattering wonder, horrifying despair, right? And so, sort of, religion is the place that kind of works with that as well, you know. And so, to do that, honestly, I had to kind of dig really deep into my life and sort of think about it. I was not intending to actually become one of these people called a Christian. I was certainly not intending to become what I take to be perhaps the most embarrassing kind of Christian these days, the dreaded evangelical one. This is like a kind of C.S. Lewis level of weird here. And C.S. Lewis actually taught at my school, at my alma mater, Magdalen
Oh.
College, Oxford. And he kind of went through this process, right, where he was, oh, I'm not one of those people. It's, oh dear, I am one of those people. I've described myself, not just described myself, but I've deeply studied Buddhism for decades. I mean, since I was about 17, I took refuge vows. I did bodhisattva vows. I'm a student of Vajrayana. These things are things that people might know about me, and they've gotten into my work for sure. But in a kind of oblique ways, in a certain way, because it's off-putting perhaps to use terms from what is called the Dharma, and how do you draw more people in, right? And also, how do you sort of face yourself without when you don't want to use these sort of plastic terms. But anyone who's paying attention would sort of figure that the ecological thought, the interrelatedness, what is called in that book the mesh, is in Buddhism what is called emptiness, and what is called the strange stranger, which is the sort of unique, absolutely unique, irreducibly unique life form. In a way, is the luminosity aspect that Buddhism talks about, right? So it's been in my work, and I've been deeply informed by what is called religion or spirituality or whatever you want to call it. I'm a meditator. I've been on retreats. I've been on 3 month long meditation retreats in the Rocky Mountains. I've been on, I've been around Mount Kailash. I've done the thing. I'm a dyed in the wool donating to my meditation teacher. I'm still doing it. Sogni Rinpoche, one of the sons of Tulku Urgyen, if that means anything to anybody. I'm a student of Dzogchen. I've been doing my Nyundro, which is the preliminary practices for Vajrayana. All these terms are rather esoteric and sort of technical, so please forgive me. But basically, what it means is I have been a really good employee of Buddha Incorporated, for years. But that was the problem, actually. That was the problem. That was the problem. Because in a certain way, I I heard it wrong for various reasons. It's not Buddhism's fault that this other thing happened to me. But I sort of heard it as kind of working for the man. Like if you do this number of mantras, if you do these number of prostrations, if you meditate for this long, you can have this nice weekend off called enlightenment. And suddenly it seemed like, oh, why is this taking me so long? Why am I running into this problem? The last few years was a bit like that. Um, I just from a tactical point of view, I have been wanting to talk to religion. I've been wanting to talk to more Americans, right? And when I arrived in America, the one thing I noticed was, wow, this is not an episode of Starsky and Hutch or Cagney and Lacey, which I thought it was, or let alone Star Trek, right, which I thought it was. This is, in fact, a very religious place. And how am I going to address that, right? And Britain is a place that likes to say that it isn't very religious, and we might get to that in a bit. Like people who like to say that they aren't, right? Like people like me, actually, scholars like to say that they're not religious. They will often say it in a very religious way. I'm going to irritate and make angry so many people in this book, but I feel like part of my job is to say the wrong thing in public, right? So when I wrote Ecology Without Nature, I basically wrote this book that said very quietly, so that the book would get accepted by the reader, who I assumed was a certain kind of eco-critic, as they used to call them, and it was the person I predicted it would be. Have you ever noticed that a lot of ecological criticism is a little bit racist and sexist? Very, very quietly, and I got death threats for that. I got stalked. I had to do police reports. It was crazy, right? So because some people heard the feminist, anti-racist, anti-homophobic dog whistles in the book, right? And in a way, I've just been sort of getting louder and louder and louder about it. And one of my very, very favorite things that I talk about in that book is what Hegel calls the dialectic of the beautiful soul, which is what a lot of people think of as religion, right? Thinking that evil is a thing that I can get rid of, right? It's either this kind of stigmatized thing inside of me, or it's in the other, or maybe it's a bit of both. But basically, I can fly a plane into it and destroy the great Satan, or I can fly a drone over it and sort of get rid of the evil that way. And Hegel very brilliantly argues that, of course, this attitude towards evil is effectively evil. And that truly religion would be realizing that you are the evil that you see in the world. And I've used this a lot because it seems to me that a lot of ecological speech is extremely invested in pointing at the evil thing, and why not, right? Like we live in this terrible, terrible situation, right? We live in a situation where, in the name of good and evil, in that beautiful soul sense, actually, some people and big oil corporations are turning this world into hell, right? In the name of heaven on earth, this world is being turned into hell, right? And my daughter came in the kitchen. It was November 2021, 17 years old. Yeah. And she was crying. And she said, Daddy, we're in hell. And, she'd been watching a school shooting video on YouTube, and she'd been reading a lot of Reddit, where the most cynical, most paralyzing voice in the room gets to be the number one voice in that space, right? And she was feeling really terrible. And I was thinking, what do I do, as a parent? I said, well, the first thing you do is you don't want to delete your child's experience. And so I said, well, you're sure we're in hell. We're in hell. We live in hell. And then in walked Oliver the cat, right? And you sort of think, well, what are we going to do about Oliver? Because Oliver's also in hell by definition. We've still got to feed Oliver, even though we're in hell. And you could sort of feel Claire's anxiety and horror beginning to subside. Like, even though you live in hell, you still got to live, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, right, book, you know. Um, I wrote this book called Hyperobjects, and a lot, it talked a lot to artists, and it talked a lot to people outside America. And I'm still trying to find a way to talk to America. If you're going to talk to America, you've got to talk to religion.
Yeah.
And in particular, you've got to talk to the Jesus side of life, just tactically speaking. And also to go back to this point about good versus evil, people like me spend a lot of time being holier than thou in the key of a kind of revenge,
Mm-hmm.
which is a kind of crude religion, right? Like, bless him, Adam McKay, he's a friend of mine. He created Hyperobject Industries based on that book. He made a film called Don't Look Up, right? And it's about a comet that's coming to destroy the world, and the mainstream media isn't covering it. But guess what? Joe Public, truck driver from my hometown of Houston, already knows in Joe Truck Driver's fundamentalist way that there's a comet coming to destroy the world. He's read it in the book of Revelation,
Right.
and the mainstream media isn't going to cover it, right? Joe Truck Driver knows that, but Joe Truck Driver knows something that film doesn't know, because unfortunately that film is in the key of, you're going to be laughing on the other side of your face when you find out the science was right. In other words, it's in the key of a kind of religion, in a bad way, of science, right? Where you've got to replace your religious beliefs with these scientific beliefs, and these posters that says believe the science and trust the science. Joe Truck Driver correctly, so sorry about this, my fellow scholars, but Joe Truck Driver's reading that correctly, right? When someone like me goes on the TV, if ever, Joe Truck Driver's looking at it going, wow, this guy's asking me to swap out my belief for their belief. And guess what? My belief is, and this is where I agree with Joe Truck Driver. I'm so sorry about this. But Joe Truck Driver's belief is better than revenge belief, because Joe Truck Driver knows something that Don't Look Up doesn't know. Ready? Jesus loves him anyway. Until people like me talk seriously to Jesus loves you anyway, we're never going to talk to Joe Truck Driver. So we're never going to get global warming solved. So the Chinese are never going to get global warming solved. So the Russians and the Indians are never going to get global warming solved. So just tactically, people like me have got to start saying words that we think of as obscene words. Like when the Sex Pistols became famous, they said really rude words on the TV. Well, rude words for people like me are pray and Jesus and, apostle and Pentecost. And so just from that point of view, in a certain rather horrible way, when people like me stopped seriously talking religion, like there's a religion department in school, right? But the one thing, especially if you're a white guy, you're not supposed to say, Jesus didn't really mean that, right? But
Right.
as soon as, like, I never got the memo. I'm an A plus theory student. I got Alpha plus, which is they stupidly grade people using Greek letters in Oxford, and they gave me Alpha plus for my theory exam. So I know I'm a student of Terry Eagleton. I've done it all. I can destroy people using Hegelian Marxism, which was why, by the way, I couldn't get a job in my early 20s, because I was so like, you're going to get rid of people. And I'd sort of gotten the memo about that. But I never got the memo that said you shouldn't say pray or Jesus. That was just some kind of implicit thing. And we can sort of talk about why, but that was like implicit somehow. And, unless there's people, kind people who know nice things, like ecology is a nice idea, right? Feminism's a nice idea, anti-racism is a nice idea. But, if we don't say things like Jesus didn't say that, Joe Truck Driver is going to get fascists telling him about Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's into that vacuum the fascists have come. Thanks to the internet, which was also created by people like me. Since I can only take responsibility myself, honestly, for the world that I see, then scholars created the internet and unleashed it on everybody, completely with the no regulations, and they stopped being like a kind of moral force in the world. Somehow we stopped saying words like pray and Jesus. Back in the olden days, Northrop Frye was an Anglican Episcopalian minister, right? I'm a literary criticism person by trade. Northrop Frye was saying things like this in the 60s, right? But you don't do that now. But I never got the memo that says you mustn't do it. So I started doing it, right? Now, so I wrote this book, and I sort of wrote this book with the help of William Blake, because
Right.
William Blake's my one of my very, very favorite writers, and I've always been wanting to write a book, a Blake book. Every romantic period scholar's got to have a Blake book. To some extent, Ecology Without Nature was my Wordsworth book, and The
Mhm.
Ecological Thought was my Coleridge book. So here comes my Blake book, right? Um, and I'm writing it, and towards the end of finishing writing it, I had this surgery, and I got my body got cut open 5 different ways. And please forgive me for the very long answer, but I'm sort of explaining why this is such a personal thing for me,
Yeah.
right? Like I got to go into philosophy, I got to go into emotion to do my job as a philosopher properly, right? I'm deeply upset about the state of the world, and furthermore, I'm a PTSD, actually complex PTSD survivor person from childhood, and I've used a lot of my stuff as a way to help people, because there's nothing like a planet scale emergency to make everybody feel like they're about 2, 3 years old, right? Huge, big corporations are committing crimes on people's bodies, and we feel really, really tiny. No wonder we can't do anything about it, because what we're seeing is stuff that's been deleted from human consciousness for whatever reason. There's the incest taboo that makes it impossible to say these things in public. So my mum was a very important social worker in the 90s, and she was basically like trying to tell her team, if you see something abusive, you see it with your eyes, it means it's everywhere, you know because they let you see it, right? So it's
Yeah.
everywhere. And watching the last administration with this psychopath narcissist like abusing people in public, torturing people, and just how incredibly triggering that can be, I decided I've got to up my game here. And then George Floyd got murdered, again in public, So I decided I got to be much more out about what's really going on here, and I got to use my stuff much more directly to help people. And as I was writing this book, I had this mega surgery. No sensible person would have said, "Oh, I know what will help Tim. Let's cut his body open 5 different ways," because it would have been fired, right? Even some shaman would not have said that, right, in this day and age. But nevertheless, I had these operations, and they was kind of like LASIK for my soul, if I can use the word soul. Sort of reset my being. And a few weeks later, I'd reconnected to my long lost Jamaican stepfather, Morris. I connected to my long lost person who I loved, Trina, also from Jamaica. And suddenly, Jesus Christ came knocking at the door, like, "Hello, I'm in here. I've been in here all the time." So, oh my giddy aunt, and so here we are, Sam, having this conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful answer. And no need to apologize for the length. I especially appreciate that the preface to the book is very long, and the exordium, and that's part of it. And so it's like, well, there is so much kind of preparatory work that needs to go into it, so that the first question has to have a very long answer to set up exactly what's going on. Because it is so
That's
much.
very
It's
kind of you.
personal, it's political, it's ecological, it's anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-fascist. I mean, so many different elements going into it, and how to talk about Jesus. There's a lot of that's
Mm,
already been written, and so
mm,
speaking of all that, you really have to set it up very delicately. And I'll say,
yeah.
to my mind, I think this book will be, I don't know if tool is the right word, but something that people can use to establish the loving, forgiving Jesus, the merciful
Oh,
Jesus,
yeah, yeah,
over
yeah.
against the racist, sexist, fascist kind of Jesus. And those, that's been a tension for a long time. And I think you've provided something where people can kind of find that Jesus. And it's not just your Jesus, it's also William Blake's Jesus. It's so many other people's
Mm-hmm.
Jesus. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's all to say.
Wow,
Really
that's
appreciate this
beautiful.
book. And there's been decades of work in eco theology, but I feel like this book is really speaking to the moment in a way that just I found very inspiring. And one of the things you say, maybe you could speak to more, is you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about how environmentalism is often very moralizing. It tends toward its own kind of scientific religion. It can be very judgmental. It has its own kind of apocalypse. And you're like, what it's
Mm-hmm.
missing is its "I have a dream" moment.
Oh,
And so
yeah,
you
yeah.
speak to this a handful of times throughout the book that I have a dream, and that the mood of that kind of the feel of that kind of expression, and of course, Reverend Martin Luther King is, again,
Mm-hmm.
speaking of a Jesus who's anti-racist, anti-sexist, who wants to
Mm-hmm.
build beloved community. So I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if you could say a little about why the I have a dream is such an
Yeah,
important part of your vision.
I would love to. Um, so, I'm a huge big fan of the word phenomenology. When I first heard this word, I was, wow, that's beautiful. It's like I was 17 years old. It's a great big word. And it's kind of like the tail that wags the dog. That's what we think when we think about phenomenology. We think about how something happens or how you say something is what you're saying, right? And this isn't really different from science. Like salt is a thing that dissolves in water. That's something that salt does. The how of salt, its phenomenology, is that it dissolves in water, right? So there's scientific phenomenology and there's humanities phenomenology. And like how a poem happens is the poem very directly, right? Like how it happens to you is what it is, right? And how religion happens to you, in a way, we need to talk about holiness, right? If we're going to go there directly, and I'm a fan of Otto's book on the holy. I like this idea that the holy is the sort of fusion of mysterium tremendum et fascinans. He says it's Latin, right, for sort of a fearful or awesome yet fascinating, wondrous mystery, right? And that where's that feeling, right, in ecological politics world, right? Why don't people get out of bed every morning going, do you know what? Solving global warming is the sexiest, most amazing, most wonderful. Wow, I'm going to do it. I'm going to solve it today. I'm going to citizens arrest the directors of Exxon, right? Like, let's reverse engineer from the best outcome, which is that MAGA guy arrests the directors of Exxon for me so I don't even have to get out of bed, right? Like, what gets MAGA guy to do that? It's got to be something really, you got to get inspired, right? And, did Martin Luther King, for 1 second, stand up there in the march on Washington and go, do you know what? You guys have no idea how racist you are. You have no idea how paralyzed in racism you really are. He gave people who thought they might be racist off ramps, right, into acting in an anti racist way. He gave them a reason to believe, right? He said, I have a dream. And I have a dream is beautiful, right? Because I have a dream. Once you say it, you've already won, actually, because you're making everyone visualize the future. You're making everyone visualize, which means visualization is an emotion, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if I say the words New York to you, I'm speaking here as a student of Buddhism, right? Like visualizing deities. If I say New York City, you don't have to build it up avenue by avenue. There's Avenue B, there's Avenue C. It's a feeling, right? New York, New York, what a wonderful town, right? That's I have a dream. That's visualization, right? You're visualizing the possibility that things can be different. Plus, as an expert in theology, as a minister, Martin Luther King knows very well that the one time when you, as an ordinary person, hear the phrase, I have a dream, is when your closest person wakes up next to you, or they're just falling asleep and they're like, I had a dream.
Mm-hmm.
I had a dream. I was doing it with Trina earlier this morning. We're on Messenger 24/7 because she's in Montego Bay right now, finishing teaching middle school. And I'm waking up at 5 a.m. going, I had a dream, nightmare, nightmare. And it's like the intimacy of that, the bravery of being able to stand up in front of millions of people and stand up in front of being recorded for the future and say, I have a dream. It's not just I'm visualizing the future, but I'm your closest neighbor. Like I'm 2 millimeters away from your face. I have a dream. Like the intimacy of it, right? And so that would be a great reason. That feeling of like I'm intimate with these other beings, right? I'm intimate with other human beings, you know, and I'm intimate with all the other life forms in this biosphere that go to make it up, and I'm imagining it being different, and I've got the awe-inspiring, scary, huge, wonderful, fascinating, mystical feeling going on inside of me. I want to stop global warming because this is I want to get out of bed and do something. Whereas people like me, very often, you know, and I'm not going to name names here. I'm going to talk phenomenology and talk about a sort of style here. I'm going to call it Eeyore. Right. You open up the paper. Who hasn't done this? You see page one, and it's the book of Revelation in the disguise of science, right? It's like giant dragon emerges from ocean, or in our case, it's like terrifying statistic X that you had no idea about. So what am I supposed to do with this? Oh, what mass extinction? Well, all the coral, what? 2% of when? You know, then you open up to the middle of the paper, and an Eeyore is saying, you know what, you're a bad person. You're not thinking about this right. You're doing this wrong, right? At page one, stupid. Middle of the newspaper, evil, stupid and evil. Did Martin Luther King make anybody feel stupid and evil? Stupid and evil is not a good place from which to launch the kind of planet scale thing that we need, right? There needs to be some other thing, right? I'm a big fan. So, you know, I'm a traumatized person, but the nicest thing that happened to me in my childhood was 1988, the house music revolution, right? Black gay people in Detroit and Chicago overlapped with punks, basically, punks on ecstasy in on the island of Ibiza, and created acid house, you know. And there is a Martin Luther King mix of a tune called "Can You Feel It" by a chap called Mr. Fingers, aka Larry Heard, and it's in the book, you know. And it is a beautiful musical, dancey rendition of the entire "I Have a Dream" speech. It's incredibly beautiful, and can you feel it? Right? Like what is the it that you're feeling? The title itself is evoking this quality that people will often chant when you're dancing. Like, can you feel it? You know, and from a certain kind of anthropological point of view, millions of years ago, some primates ate some fermented fruit, right? Like, and they were in a group of over 150 where grooming is no longer effective as a means of social bonding. And they probably did it a few times. And there were probably many, many, many common ancestors that did that, right? And they do what you do when you're on drug time, right? You kind of jump around and you're all in sync and you don't have to groom each other anymore because you're all synchronized to this neurotoxin. And somebody says, make some noise, or can you feel it, or whatever the equivalent of that is, right? And that's the beginning of ritual and language and religion. And, you know, why is art so powerful? Why is religion and drama so powerful? Because it's obviously coming in an evolutionary sense from beyond the human, you know? And so this kind of can you feel it quality is very much in your body as a kind of, it's like the front end of a symbiosis, right? The feeling of being symbiotically linked. Because here you are, you've taken this fermented fruit, you're linked to this plant, right? And you're linked to all the other people who are intoxicated with you. And you're like, yeah, right, you know, and that's the essence of ritual. That's the essence of drama. And of course, in a Dionysian style religion like Christianity, that's very important. You know, also in Vajrayana, where drinking alcohol is permitted somehow in that crazy corner of Buddhism.
Yeah, I'll tell you, there's something about the way that this book is written where there's spots where you really feel can you feel it? And it's just, you know, you're able to kind of trace the relationship between body and soul. It's like, well, maybe the soul
Oh,
is the body. And you like, wait, hold on a second. There it is. Oh, I can feel it. And I
mm.
know, you know, there's one
Oh,
spot where
wow.
you're like, you know, look, the biosphere is the body of Christ. Can I get a witness? And I'm reading that and being like,
Yeah.
yes, yes, you can. And so, yeah,
You know,
it's
it's lovely that you would say that, Sam. That for me, always, you can never directly say the truth. You can only evoke it. And I'm sort of jiggling a key in a lock here because a lot of meditation is like that, right? Whether it be Christian or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever it be, you're jiggling a key in a lock. The Sanskrit word is upaya, skillful means. And it's kind of like you got to jiggle it to make it unlock. You can't just directly clunk. You got to sort of evoke it, you know. And so I'm ever so glad that at certain points in the book, something does transmit, you know, because it was very much written to inspire people in a very strong way. In a way, it's a sort of ad, right,
Hmm.
for the kinds of collective feeling, right? Like we know what to do. We know what to do. We know to stop oil, right? But we're not feeling it yet, right? You know, we don't know, we don't feel like we belong yet to planet Earth. And when people say that we do, usually it's said in the key of this great big thing deletes your tiny thing. This great big world thing is much more important than your street. It's much more important than your family. It's much more important than, and this is unfortunately the kind of, I'm ever so sorry, but this is a very popular form of holism, right? Where they
Hmm.
say the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts, but it's a kind of fascist holism because it's saying that the bundle that you're in, the bigger and fatter the gang of things that you're in, the more powerful it is, right? And so, like, you don't mean anything compared to this great big gang. You know, that's basically fascism, you know. And so, how to get people to feel like they care without deleting? You see, this is what's beautiful about I Have a Dream because it's doing both. It's opening up this huge, vast, you know, because ending white supremacy is a planet scale thing, right? Like, if America is anything, it's an ad for a kind of future world. I feel like it, in a way, America isn't a country yet because of slavery. And so, like, in order to kind of start to work on that is to foment and create. There is not a difference actually between, you know, this fascist idea of world government and, you know, world whatever that is politics and America. They sort of, for me, they kind of fuse together. And if America is anything, it's a place that makes cool things out of broken European stuff, right? Like the T-shirt, you know, it's a broken shirt. The jeans, it's a broken pair of trousers. Black Lives Matter is broken people making incredible politics out of it. The blues, it's like broken Gregorian scale, you know, broken by African culture, right? And like, let's make cool stuff that everybody loves, right? And if we're going to be going up against the notion of great, as in make America great again, I think what we need to do is get into this idea of cool, you know, which turns out, of course, to be a Yoruba spiritual concept that then percolates into African American culture and is like, I'll see your MAGA hat and I'll raise you a George Lucas hyperspace tunnel from 1977 because that was cool, right? You know, and like cool versus great. You need to get some kind of affect going. I take affect to be a kind of transpersonal, more than a feeling, like a sensation. Like when I say, can you feel it? It literally could mean, are you feeling that what in yoga is called prana,
Hmm.
right? You know, in Aristotle, catharsis is Greek for what in yoga is called the all-pervading wind, otherwise known as the tingles, right? Badly translated in medieval literary criticism as purgation. You're not getting rid of everything, you're getting the tingles, right? It's this transpersonal, quote unquote, biological, but what is that sort of rush? You know, this is the chemical, right? These are the phenomenological chemicals required to want to get out of bed in the morning and be like, you know, I'm going to stroke my cat and kiss my partner and stop global warming.
Yeah, and that you just feel it. You just like, oh, I want this so bad. This is so fascinating. It doesn't just sound like homework or a to do. Like, oh, okay, yeah, there's this problem. I'll have to sacrifice a lot in my life, and my lifestyle is
Mm-hmm.
not going to be as good. Like, no, this will be so much more fun, so much
Yeah,
more
exactly.
enjoyable, so much sexier, so much
Exactly.
cooler.
Exactly. Much cooler, much more pleasure,
Yeah.
right? Actually, much more actual pleasure. You know, okay, sure, there might be various things that we need to do, but you know, once I know that other life forms are suffering because of my behavior, I can't really enjoy myself anymore. Like once I know as a white guy that other people who are not white guys are suffering because of my white guy-ness, I can't really enjoy myself anymore. So like enhancing other people's pleasure. And on that subject, like how human beings get on with each other is how they get on with other life forms. So very, very high on my list is ending white supremacy as like a metric. Plus also Black Lives Matter is a planet scale political movement along with Me Too, right? These are two other cool things that America has recently invented, along with T-shirts and funk, right? And these are things that everybody wants to get into. We should totally embrace it and be like, this is how we get to really care about the biosphere. And of course, we all know that the long history of environmentalism often is about skipping a step because of white supremacy, right? So that there's all this sort of like tentacles of white supremacy in older environmentalist organizations and thinking precisely for that reason. So like how to how to in a way get to the dolphins is to practice anti-racism as much as you possibly can, right? And like all the other stuff will almost fall into place automatically once we get that stuff sorted out. So people like me should maybe talk a little bit less about coral and a little bit more about racism, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I know the kind of right wing talking point is always like, well, that's making white people feel bad for their whiteness. It's making men feel
Oh,
bad for their maleness. And whenever,
sure.
I'm teaching these kinds of things, I'll notice there's white men in the room. And I'm like, hey guys, this isn't about feeling bad. It's
Mm-hmm.
about feeling good that you have an opportunity to make the world a more joyful place, to a more
Right on.
merciful place. This isn't about guilt and shame. This is really
Right
about
on.
joy
I
and
have a
mercy.
I would love to say some things to that. Yes, I would love to. I'm sure you're not contradicting this, but a little bit of guilt and shame never did anybody any harm,
Right.
right? A little bit of, oh dear. Like there's only one kind of person who doesn't have any guilt at all, and that person's called a psychopath, right? Like they don't have any guilt, they don't have any anxiety, right? Like a little bit of guilt and shame. And also, but also you're quite right, right? Like you want to see structural racism. Look, it's this whiteness, right? Like it's sort of I couldn't help it, right? Like in a way, structural racism in a certain way lets you off the hook. It's like there's this structure, right? And now we know that we can do something about it. And in a funny way, it's akin to the idea of original sin. And people describe slavery as the original sin of America. But in a funny way, if you translate it, you could say original sin is structural sin, right? Like Christianity itself has a theory of structural, whatever that is, flawedness, badness, right? So that actually, knowing that you're a sinner should be, in a funny way, this is going to sound odd, it should be like the nicest thing that you say to yourself. You should say that with the nicest possible way that you say to yourself, and you should say it to yourself, right? Like in a funny way, the definition of being a good person is thinking that you might be a very bad person. Like please agree with me that being a good teacher means thinking that you might be a really bad
Right.
teacher, and being a truly great country might be suspecting that you might be a bit of a blank, blank, blank country, right? Like, as opposed to we're going to get rid of all that stuff. What's wrong with a little bit of guilt and shame? It never hurts anybody.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And I really appreciate the way you bring that in the book of connecting like structural racism with the structural sin of original sin. And then there's the gentleness of, oh, I'm a sinner. And that's okay. And this is the work. And otherwise, I think that's always one of those things people get so turned off of Christianity for. They're like original
Mm-hmm.
sin that just seems like it's here to make me feel terrible about my life. And it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
it's here to show you how messy the beautiful world we're in really is, and that the
Yeah.
ambiguity isn't a bad thing. The ambiguity is kind of what helps set us free.
Yeah. Beautiful. On that note, I'm going to say a thing that real theologians don't say anymore. You listen to ex-evangelical podcasters, they'll be sure to say Christianities in the plural, and they'll be sure to say the white supremacist version is also Christianity. I'm just going to come out and say that isn't Christianity. That's the European version of it, which I was could have indoctrinated into as a kid, right? And Parsifal is the European Christian myth, right? Without the inconvenience of Jewish people. Here's this blonde criminal moron who saves the Grail Knights from the wound, right? They are wounded somehow, they're flawed, right? But they can be perfect, which is very much against this idea of original sin, it seems to me. And the trouble with Donald Trump is, unfortunately, he falls into the archetype of Parsifal. There's an extent to which evangelicals or whoever they're called voted for the guy because he is a criminal moron, not despite the fact that he's a criminal moron, right? Because unfortunately, this is what Parsifal does, right? In the Wagner opera, Parsifal kills a swan, which is the death penalty in the Grail Knights community, and he's a bit of a blonde, lunkhead, and he he cures Amfortas from the Die Wunder, and what is the wound? It seems to me that this wound is the wound called being alive. To be a life form is to be wounded. I never asked for these weird, sort of floppy, cauliflowery ears. If Steve Jobs had designed these things, they'd be really efficient little pinpricks. They do just as well as the iPhone little pinprick thing. All this messy stuff is just some kind of evolution accident thing. And if anything, this book, if you really want to go in there, is a theory of Christianity with all of the teleologicalness cut out, right? Like, I think in a way, public enemy number two for me would be, philosophy wise, would be telos, the concept that things have a point to them. Public enemy number one is the metaphysics of presence. We can, once a deconstructor, always a deconstructor. But telos, right? That it doesn't, if a cup looks like a cup and it quacks like a cup, in other words, you can drink out of it, then it's a cup, right? Aristotle, right? He was Alexander the Great's tutor, right? Macedonians are for enslaving barbarians. They sound like sheep. That's what they did, bar, bar, bar. And barbarians are for being enslaved by Macedonians. And that's their telos, that's their point, right? And in a funny way, for me, miracle and accident are the same kind of word, actually. And what's beautiful about life is that it's a beautiful accident that just happens, right? And the just happening quality is the wound, right? Die Wunder, yeah. And you don't want to get rid of that. You don't want to delete that. You could, if you delete that, then you create, a world where there's no life, where there's just chemistry. And in a funny way, chemistry is just like mechanical revenge. This chemical eats that chemical. Physics as well, like the black hole just automatically swallows everything. But life is a place in the universe where chemicals are hesitating from the revenge a little bit because of quantum theory. They are, in a funny way, having mercy on each other. Like, life is a place that shows you that we live in a merciful universe. Like, have you ever been in a fight and you're thinking, wait a minute, this is really stupid. This is stupid. Right? Maybe thought itself is a function of a kind of hesitation like that. Like, where's the light switch? I'm really jet lagged. I can't find it. Right? Like, this funny hesitation symptom of a kind of failure is what's beautiful and special about life. And you could extract chemicals made out of life from deep underground and turn the whole biosphere back into chemistry. It wouldn't be very, very difficult. And this might be the fundamental problem with the oil industry, that we're turning the world into a very boring, reliable, unfunny world of revenge, really. Where, in a way, what's cool about life is that it's always a comedy in the wide shot. Charlie Chaplin said it's a tragedy close up, right? Like, here's a strand of RNA, it's trying to kill itself. It feels really suicidal strand of RNA, and it tears itself apart only to find that it's replicated itself, right? Because comedy is the wide shot, tragedy is the close up, comedy is the wide shot, And so by accident, the very attempt to get rid of oneself resulted in one reproducing oneself, which, when it happens to one guy on stage, is called Oedipus, right? But when it happens to 8 people, it's called Curb Your Enthusiasm. Yeah.
Right.
And so, if anything, Christianity is talking to the comic aspect of the universe, which I take to be deeper than the tragic aspect of the universe. And the crucifixion, if anything, is somebody going to the end with the tragic aspect of it, absolutely to the like, I'm going to let myself be scapegoated by every single possible person and group ever, and go completely to the end. And even like, my God, why have you forsaken? Why have you forsaken me? Right, which I take to be very, I read it very differently from Slavoj Žižek, um, and that all happens, and then the resurrection. In the close up, it's a tragedy. In the wide shot, it's not ha ha funny comedy. Comedy means comedy is aesthetically a kind of forgiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I only recently learned how to forgive, so I know what this is, right? Like a couple of years ago, I found that I had forgiven my dad, and it was for all the things he did. And what it meant was that I could love him and hate him and admire him and fear him and regret him and be into him and be bored by him in this huge, great big meadow inside me. And the space, like I was like, what is this? What is this weird feeling I'm having of space? Oh, it must be forgiveness because it's in the word, right? The forgive. It's like you're giving yourself the space to have all of those feelings, right? And it's sort of made out of mercy in a way. Like mercy is the atomic structure, right? Where you're like, you know, I don't know why I'm hitting you anymore. I can't even remember. I forgot. Like basically, I just thought, why are we having this fight again? Just the basic like atom of it is just forgetfulness. And maybe that's the basic atom of being a conscious being is just being a bit forgetful. Maybe one of the funny things about AI that makes it a bit demonic is that it remembers everything because it's made of silicon. And maybe AI to become more moral should just be trained to forget randomly and often. And maybe that's the initial consciousness is actually, wait a minute, did I leave the gas on? Shit. Like in a way, maybe deja vu, which seems like the anomaly, is the primordial awareness. Like, wait, have we had this conversation before? That funny sort of I don't know anymore. When Dante's going into heaven and drinking Lethe, the waters of forgetfulness, and this is in the book. There's this funny feeling of like I think I know I was a sinner. I know I did, but it's not hitting me the same way as it was a while ago. Like I can remember it, but I forget why it was bad, but it was bad. But I don't get it anymore. Kind of that funny feeling, right? Where you realize that you live in a merciful world with a merciful God, where God's basic sort of essence is mercy.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of those kind of jiggling the key in the lock kind of movements that show up throughout the book. Is this kind of remembering is a forgetting of forgetting, and the way of forgiveness is kind of taking revenge against revenge, and
Oh,
so there's so many of those kind of
oh,
movements, including the devil. Also, the devil's such an important part
mm-hmm,
of a book. Of course, a book called Hell. The
mm-hmm,
devil's going to be kind of front and center, and that's one of those
mm-hmm,
characters. You're kind of like jiggling that lock a little. Sometimes the devil seems like our friend. Sometimes it's a foe. Maybe
mm-hmm,
ecological action requires us to make a deal with the devil. So I wonder if you could speak
mm-hmm.
to the devil, because I find that that's a
I
character
would
a lot
love
of
to.
eco theologians really don't talk about. They'll talk about
No,
stewardship and stuff like that, but they don't really go
yeah,
into the devil.
yeah. Um, One reason to talk about the devil is that if you don't talk about the devil, or if you have contempt for even slightly talking about the devil, then you're writing off a whole lot of people who do talk about the devil. And a lot of those people are African American people. And my wife, Trina, and her mum are always saying, oh, that was the devil. And it's like, are these people idiots? Are you very really saying that non white people who talk about this are wrong, in some fundamental way? And this gets to thinking about what was colonialism, what was settler colonialism in a way, but a war against the Holy Spirit in the guise of so called animism, right? Like in the guise of this primitivistic belief in the idea that there are people who believe primitivistically that pencils are alive and that so-called inanimate objects are not inanimate, right? They have spirit, right? And what is this spirit but this sort of quality of movement that is inherent in everything, right? And so there's a reason to talk about things pertaining to spirits and spiritual and spirit. If you're going to talk spirituality, what you really want to do is get out of this mind-body dualism, which I take to be a master-slave dualism. I think the trouble with our world is the master-slave template, which I think might be about to snap in various ways. And I think a lot of the fascism around the world is people realizing that somewhere towards the front or the back of their head and sort of holding on to this template for dear life, because actually it's doesn't people realizing it doesn't mean anything, doesn't do anything, right? But the devil is often seen through this master servant lens, right? As a, like, for example, as a servant who becomes your master. One of my favorite things right now is listening over and over to The Soldier's Tale by Stravinsky, and to the Job, the Mask for Dancing by Vaughan Williams, because a lot of my life seems to be a little bit encapsulated in these things right now. All kinds of funny accidents happen to me all the time, and all kinds of funny things happen. And in lots of ways, it's actually quite convenient to not say, that was me, that was my problem, I'm a bad person. What if that was an idea that the devil wanted you to think? It's very recursive. But anyway, to go back to this master servant thing. So, traditionally religion is about serving some perfect master, right? God is this perfect master and you can't serve them right because they're perfect. So you have religion to fix the anomalies, right? Now imagine the inverse, which is a servant who does everything that you tell them to do perfectly, right? Absolutely perfectly, like with all the unintended consequences that you didn't specify verbally, but they were implied, right? Every story you've ever heard about the devil, yeah, but it's also everything about the biosphere, right? Like you wash your hands with antibacterial soap, you make the bacteria evolve to be worse. You buy an avocado from Chile, you cause a lot of air fuel to be used, right? And so the biosphere also is a kind of being that humans have treated like a servant, right? And they've wanted this servant to be perfect and to give them more and more efficiently the goodies, right? And in some ways, efficiency and evil are kind of, they're in the same bailiwick. Like, what makes Agent Cooper into a scary guy in Twin Peaks? His desire to solve the case and make it right as efficiently as possible in a certain way is what gets him into the trouble. And what's nice about life is the inefficiency, and what's nice in a way about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I'm fully down with G.K. Chesterton on this one. It's a kind of fairy tale injunction. It's like, you can do anything, just don't eat that fruit, right? And that's very inefficient, right? Like, fairy tales are very inefficient, right? They have this, at least one part of them where this mechanical causality doesn't work, right? But you could argue that in a funny way, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is actually a consent thing, right? Like, I have a lot of t-shirts that say consent is sexy, and in a funny way, God is saying, just don't touch me there. Just don't, whatever you do, whatever you want, just don't touch that tree. And if you have to ask why, then it's over, right? Like, why don't you want me to do it? What, you asking me why? Like, we're done now, right?
Yeah.
Just don't do it. I just don't want you to do it. I don't even not like it. Just don't do it. Just don't. I'm just telling you not to do it. Then you do it, and then you know what good and evil is. Not because the fruit is some kind of drug, which is like what Satan thinks it is in like Paradise Lost, but because you violated a rule, you violated a consent rule, and you just sort of overstepped a boundary that God basically, just don't touch me there. I just don't want you to do it. And so, in a funny way, treating the biosphere like it's your perfect slave that you're going to get everything out of more and more and more and more efficiently turns it into this domineering master being that is now like coming to get you because big oil made it do that, in a certain way, right? And so and so there's a funny paradox, right? Because it's kind of like there's the concept of evil, yeah, which can itself be a kind of evil, and so it's kind of recursive, you know. I sometimes think, and this is where the book gets into a thing called flipped Gnosticism, right? I sometimes think that it's not that we are spiritual beings trapped in a material universe. I know that's very popular, right? It's popular in Marxism. It's not just popular in New Age, right? It's like we are beautiful communist beings trapped in a world of nasty social processes that we can transcend. So it's not necessarily talking about, you know, what everybody likes to demonize, to use that word, as Gnosticism. But what if it was the other way around? What if we were beautiful, fragile, physical beings, including all of our thoughts, which just emerge from our, whatever that is, sentience, trapped in a world of horrible, horrible ideas about them, one of which is master versus slave, right? Like, in a funny way, maybe the devil is a really, really terrible idea. That like in a way, the angels and the devils are thoughts in God's head, and God clearly gets a C plus for creating them, And then so is God like, you know what, now I've got this C plus, I'm really going to go for it. You get a D for creating a physical world. Or is the physical world actually in a funny way a kind of improvement? Or is it actually, yeah, I'm going to get a D because trying to win is the problem? Like, so I'm a Miltonist. Milton went to my school and I love John Milton. I had the honor of teaching a class last term on John Milton's Paradise Lost because the teacher had a heart attack. And I got to revisit that beautiful poem. And Satan lands on the roof, on the wall of Eden, and basically goes, "Wow, this is an improvement. This has got to be better. Look at this. This is amazing, right?" But actually, in a funny way, what if it was like, I'm stepping out of this, trying to get it right game altogether, right? Like the physical universe, in a funny way, is the silence and the mystery of God, right? Like the word that the son says in that book is basically shh, right? Like silence, like that's the initial word, like to create the universe out of God themselves, because it's ex deo creation we're talking about here, is to create a kind of God shaped whole in God, right? And so, like, what's the most obvious stupid thing you can say about God? They're not here, right? In a funny, perverse way, the total absence of God is actually a great proof of God's existence from the certain point of view. That actually, there's a top level, or at least, of the physical universe, which is a kind of mystery level, right? It's even within thought itself. It's the possibility of this kind of opacity, right? It's called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. There is always, within truth itself, is this kind of physicality, right? And it's the word mystery comes from the Greek word muein, which is onomatopoeia for the universe is God going and maybe that's the saving grace of it, right? And maybe part of the problem are these demonic, angelic, whatever you want to call them, ideas, memes, tweets. They lie around forever. They can't be destroyed. They just hang around like the blood libel. It's just sort of there, waiting for some, you know, fascicized pod person to just hit retweet, right? All you need to do to be evil is to hit retweet, like Hannah Arendt would say, right? Like evil and banality are kind of weirdly related. And of course, the more efficiently you do it, I was just following orders is exactly, I was just being efficient. I was just obeying very as efficiently as I could the injunction to send all these people to their death.
That's reminds me. There's a few times in the book where you talk about how the kingdom of God is at hand, and this kind of realized eschatology, I guess they'd say. It's like, no, this is it. And you're like, well, but God's not here. It's like, well, you
mm,
know, if you
mm, mhm,
can you feel it? and
mhm,
uh and to think that's like,
mhm.
if people can just kind of tune into that, like, no, it's at hand. And if you don't feel like it's at hand, that's part of it being at hand, is it's so close you don't notice it, because it is like
Yeah,
it's on your skin. You can't get separate
yeah,
from it to look at it like an object, like the metaphysics of presence, right? It's not this thing that's clear and
yeah,
present, and it's just right
yeah,
there. And
yeah,
I don't know, I think that
yeah.
there's just so many times where you just really feel that in the book. You're like, oh right, it's right here. And
Mm,
me not quite
mhm,
getting
mhm.
it is me getting it. And
Oh,
then you can kind
well,
of feel that, and you're like, this is the Jesus that undoes the, master slave template, and
mm,
between slave
mm,
and free and man and woman and all of these
mhm,
binaries.
mhm,
And you're like, oh,
mhm,
and that
mhm,
it's right here, that energy is right
mm,
here, like the dream is
mhm,
palpitating, like right here, and
mhm,
you can
mhm,
feel it. And so I don't
mhm,
know, that's all to say, I really like this book. It's one of those things you like
mm,
listen to an album, you're like, that was great. I already need to go
mm,
back and listen to these tracks again, and
mm,
like
mm, mm.
memorize them so I can sing along. So we're
Well,
now over
you know
time,
this
but
this happened to me too, Sam.
mm,
Basically, I wrote a lot of the ideas without knowing what they were going to be until I'd written them. And some of the most key parts of that book were me typing, going, "What? Wow, that's really good. I wonder what I'm going to say. I wonder what my fingers are going to type next because I'm not thinking this. I'm in this sort of zone, you know." And so, yeah, whatever that means, I just kind of let myself do a big old stage dive into my own messed up confusion. And that's probably why the book turned out to be a nice one. And I'm ever so grateful to you for wanting to talk about it with me.
oh yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate hearing kind of that process, because even when reading it, I'm like, how do you, what did you come up with an outline for all of this? And and to think like, I don't know, sometimes you don't even know what you're typing, and you just, yeah, the stage dive is a really beautiful metaphor.
This was the most wrong looking book that I ever sent to a press. It was so embarrassing. I let myself send it with like little notes to self in it and asterisks and stuff. And the readers' reports came back like, there's a funny little bit here where there's this funny little fragment sentence, and I'm like, oh my goodness. And so like allowing myself to be exposed and sort of embarrass myself a bit is kind of like why it turned out to be good. And I feel like I've got the hang of it. I want to put myself in situations where I'm in public, probably with Trina as well, because Trina talks all the time theology and Jesus and Christianity. And I think, we need to be talking together, at least modeling how to do dialogue about some of these things in a way that is like intrinsically vulnerable, and isn't ever about I've got the idea, I've got the magic key here, you know. And sort of like now I've got the hang of it. And thank you for giving me a platform to sort of do that a little bit today. I would like to do this a lot more. And and I sort of feel like this is a big shift in my life in general, where you're gonna hear a lot more of this. um, I'm so tempted to say crap from me in the not too distant future.
That's good. That's, yeah, crappy in a comedic way, the silliness of everything, this the accidents of everything. And yeah, and geez, there's so much we didn't touch on, because there's just a
Mm-hmm.
lot of topics in that book. I mean, like the chapter on abortion, it was amazing, and just like really mind-blowing ideas in there. And or there was this great line about the scene after the resurrection, when Mary Magdalene sees Jesus and Jesus says, "Don't touch me," right? No le me tangere. And you said, that's just like MC Hammer. You can't touch this. And like things like that. It's just like, that was a really hilarious and brilliant reading of that passage. And so, yeah, I highly recommend people go check this out. I especially think people interested in the work that the Forum on Religion and Ecology does will find this extremely refreshing, but also just the average person out there who's wondering, what's Jesus really about? And
Mm.
what's going on right now? I think it'll be a refreshing and inspiring book for a lot of people. So really glad that you were able to make time to talk to us, and definitely when you do more vulnerable crap, I want to have you back on because I
Wonderful.
have like hours of more things I want to chat to you about. So uh,
Oh, it's wonderful.
yeah, well, thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you so much,
It's been
Tim.
an honor.
Yeah,
Thank you.
honor's all mine,
Really.
really, really,
Oh,
truly.
gosh.
So yeah, thanks, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.